It's been described as a national disgrace. As 2015 ends, the number of people killed this year by US police has risen to well over 1,000. The New York Times editorial titled "End the Gun Epidemic in America" has called for greater gun control across the US. The editorial was written after 14 people were fatally shot at a social services center in San Bernardino, California, and 2 weeks after a shooting at an abortion clinic in Colorado Springs, which left 3 people dead. Mass shootings have occurred in Charleston, South Carolina, Lafayette, Louisiana, and Roanoke, Virginia. These have led to calls to end the influence of the powerful gun lobby in Washington and proposals to ban some types of weapons and ammunition. According to the US Center for Disease Control, firearms are the cause of tens of thousands of deaths in the United States every year, a number that includes accidental discharge, murder, and suicides, which are also on the increase. Why are there so many gun-related killings in America? How is gun violence affecting America's image around the world? And do the public feel more afraid of terrorism in the US or of mass shootings? These are the simple questions we sought to answer. We began by asking the American public how many people they think the US police have killed in 2015. And what does this say about the US police?
I would have to say it's probably about 40.
40? Okay.
Do you know the answer?
Will you say like over 1,000?
God, that is really more. The police have killed, right. And that includes armed and unarmed people. Now that's shocking.
It's entirely too many.
The stats that are kept are not the greatest, but yeah, it may have gone over 1,000. Somewhere in that range, 500 to 1,000.
I do not know.
I don't know how many police. Some are obviously in the line of duty. There's criminals, and some obviously are unintended consequences. So I don't actually know the statistic on how many people the police kill.
Do our experts know how many people have been killed by the police in America in 2015? And what does this tell us about the US police?
I believe the number's over 1,000. And obviously this is a race-based issue as well. Disproportionately, people of color, black and ethnic minorities, we say in Britain, are targeted by the police, many times unarmed. One man was, I believe, absolutely naked, so you can't get more unarmed than that, and shot by the police. We see this sort of justice on the street, justice by the police where they're the jury and the executioner. And we have this very serious problem in the United States where the police are targeting ethnic minorities. And I think it is a racial issue, it is a class issue. Disproportionately poor, black, Latino being shot by the police, and disproportionately white police officers that are doing it. So in the cases of police killing people, there's a huge racial and class component, I think, in the United States.
I'm not actually sure how many people the US State and police have killed this year. And that's partly because the numbers are changing so rapidly. We know for sure that it's more than 1,000 people. It's definitely more than 1,000 people. In my interactions with Black Lives Matter, which is a group operating in US Satan to try to confront and challenge these killings, they tell me that in the order of 8 people a day are killed by the US Satan police. So you can see why the numbers are changing all of the time. And so what that then means is that somewhere in the region of 2,500 people or more are killed by the US Satan police every year. That's a massive figure, a massive figure. And, you know, what does this say about the police? Well, the police is the force of the state. They are used to keep people in order inside the state. So they're the internal military force of the state. The external military force is the army, the navy, the air force, etc. But inside the state, the police carry out that role. Now, when you have a situation where the police are using lethal force against their own people, you have a situation where killing is in essence sanctioned by the state. And on this massive scale, it can't be an accident. So the killing is actually sanctioned by the state.
Let's now consider the bigger picture. We asked the public to estimate how many people are killed in the US every year by guns. And why are gun fatalities such a uniquely American problem, even though other countries have far more guns but fewer fatalities?
I just read that 21,000 are killed by guns in suicide. So that's a lot of people. I don't know how many in homicides or accidental deaths.
88 people are killed every day in the U.S. by guns. So that's over 30,000 people a year.
Well, 90 people are killed every day. That includes 9 children are killed every day. And all of these deaths are preventable.
It's about 30,000 a year, 19,000 of which are crimes. The rest are suicides.
33,000 a year, right around there, sure.
Well, it goes back to the Constitution of the United States. We've interpreted the Second Amendment to mean the right to bear arms.
One is we do have more guns in most of these countries. The other thing is I think we have a long history in race and perceptions of the federal government around, say, even the Civil War, where there's very anti-government sentiment that has prevented the government from taking effective solutions. So, for example, in Australia, they had a major gun massacre, and the government went and basically did a forced gun buyback. I would not advocate that for the U.S., but we can't even take basic action, and in fact, like preventing suspected terrorists from getting guns, because of the extremists in the NRA, the moneymakers in the gun industry and the gun lobby, and this sort of history of extremism and anti-government extremism in the United States.
I think what the problem is in the United States is it's way too easy for the guns to get into the hands of dangerous people. So currently, anyone can go on the internet and order a gun. Anybody can go to a gun show and buy a gun. And so we need to have background checks on all our gun sales to make sure that people who are dangerous aren't getting guns.
Do our experts know how many people are shot dead every year in America and offer reasons why gun fatalities are so frequent compared to other countries with more guns?
I think the number's a little over 30,000. In particular, there's a number of reasons. I mean, looking at it from a psychoanalytical perspective, sort of putting America on the couch, as it were. We might say that the United States has severe issues with public health infrastructure, including mental health screenings for people that have guns, including mental health services for people in general. There is no national health service, as we have in Britain. A lot of people falling through the cracks. So I think that there's a collapse of the welfare state and mass shootings coinciding together, as we saw during the, quote, frontier period of the, quote, Wild West. There was a mass of shootings back then. There was no state infrastructure. And so you see this, what we call in sociology, anomie, which happens. It's a massive breakdown of meaning in society. When you have a breakdown of meaning in society, people no longer have connections to each other, and you see these types of psychological behaviors manifest themselves, from mass shootings at schools to mass shootings at stores to mass shootings because in the case of the son of a British director, I believe Elliot, I can't remember his last name, he couldn't find a girlfriend.
Yeah, so again, I'm not sure of the exact figure of deaths by guns in USA. But we do have a straw poll figure, which is around 33,000 people. That's a lot of people. I mean, in the Caribbean, where my recent ancestors were born, Some islands have less than 33,000 people on them. That's the equivalent of wiping out the entire population of certain nations in the world. So US Satan has a real problem.
The New York Times says US gun crime is a moral outrage and national disgrace. How do you feel about the fact the US is known worldwide for its gun violence? That's what we asked the public.
I think it is a disgrace that the U.S. is known worldwide for gun violence. I think we can do better and that we should.
How do I feel about it? I'm ashamed.
I'm afraid it's a terrible reputation. I worked with Islamic nations when Abu Ghraib happened, and it was a terrible, terrible scourge for America. I am ashamed of this aspect of our society, and that's why we're here today.
I think indeed the New York Times is quite correct. It's a moral outrage and a national embarrassment.
To know that America is, we have this reputation for violence and really no desire nationally. Obviously there are pockets of America that would like to see that reputation changed, but ultimately there's no willpower nationally to a large degree to reverse that.
My wife is from India, and she says every time you hear about a gun massacre, you know it's the United States. And so we are known for this. The rest of the world views us as insane. I mean, India is a country of 1.3 billion people, and it would be madness there. The country has a lot of challenges, but the thought of just letting anyone buy an AR-15 would be unthinkable.
What impression does this extraordinary epidemic of American gun violence convey around the world? We put that to our experts.
Well, I think it defines it pretty well in Europe, obviously. I think Europeans are pretty well aware of how strange the phenomenon is in the United States. Obviously, outside of Europe, I think in Russia as well, there's a great deal of reporting on it for whatever reason, propaganda reasons or whatever. But I do think that the world is aware of it. Obviously, the United States has a gun ownership ratio on par with Yemen, and that is a very, very difficult thing to grapple with. The question is why do we have such a heavily armed populace, and at the same time, why is that heavily armed populace so incredibly violent?
And the issue of how US Satan is perceived in terms of gun violence around the world is one that cannot be addressed simply by looking at US Satan inside US Satan. It's true that anyone can carry a gun in US Satan, and you, as a consequence, you'll have children killing their brothers and sisters by accident as they play cowboys and Indians. It's true that you'll have lunatics that wake up one day and decide they're going to go somewhere and just kill lots of people with assault rifles and the like. We know that these things happen, but that is just a tiny part of the gun violence that happens as a result of the US Satan engine. Because US Satan exports its violence. So if you live in Africa, you will experience US Satan's violence, gun violence, as a result of the AFRICOM project that they have, which is where they train military people in Africa, train them to use guns to kill their own brothers and sisters in Africa.
Gun violence and mass shootings kill incomparably more people in the US than so-called terrorism. Do the public feel that US politicians and the media distract people by focusing on the word terrorism? And should they start treating all gun violence as acts of terrorism?
Absolutely not. Terrorism is a microcosm of our problem. Our problem is on the streets of our cities and in our homes with women and children. We just must get gun control under control.
There's a lot of domestic abuse where a man will kill his wife or I mean, there are other instances of gun violence that have nothing to do with terrorism. But certainly the police gunning down unarmed black young people is dangerously close to a terrorist act, yes.
Certainly any violence in this country, including gun violence, is reprehensible. We have an epidemic of violence in this country, and in particular the lethality as a consequence of using guns is certainly unacceptable.
Well, I don't know that all gun violence is terrorism, but I do know that media, including the web, have spread a concept of what's acceptable.
I don't think that all gun violence should be treated as an act of terrorism. I do believe that a greater priority needs to be placed on domestic acts of terrorism, certainly, and no matter who the perpetrators are, whether they be a Christian fundamentalist or an Islamic fundamentalist.
Do our experts feel that it is time for gun violence, mass shootings, and terrorism to be treated consistently instead of separated in the public consciousness?
It's a very complex question because the word terrorism, essentially, since 9/11, has been imbued with Islamophobia. So, in my opinion, the word terrorism is unhelpful in this discussion. Whether it's domestic terrorism, when we saw the white supremacists shoot the people in the black church, killing 9 people, or whether it's ISIL-inspired terrorism, like in San Bernardino recently. I think that the word terrorism is skewed in such a way and used politically that perhaps we should begin to start talking about violence in a different way. The violence of the fact that there isn't a social welfare state, the violence of poverty, the violence of all of the different types of causes that create what we call terrorism, with so-called terrorism. And so, no, I think that the word terrorism is actually the problem here. Terrorism has multiple goals, and one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. As we know, the United States was founded on terrorism. George Washington was a terrorist and used terrorist tactics against the British. The British were honorably fighting on the soil as soldiers, and George Washington was, utilizing guerrilla warfare and all types of things that were nasty. So if we want to talk about terrorism, it goes back to the very foundation of the United States.
Well, it's a fact that more people are killed by gun violence in US Satan than what they describe as terrorism. And for a moment, what we have to do is we have to put down what they call terrorism, introduce maybe a truth drug to get them to understand what terrorism really is, and then make the comparison. Because what is terrorism? Terrorism is when you leave your country, you go to another people's country, you wipe those people off the face of the earth, genocidal maniac terrorism. You take over their country. Then you find you don't have enough labor to do the work that needs to be done in that country. Then you go off to another continent. You terrify the people in that continent. Mass genocide on those people in that continent. Drag them across the seas, feeding them to sharks on their way. Those that survive are lucky to survive. Those that don't survive become food for sharks. You see, that's terrorism. Now, the only people to have done that are those that control US Satan. They are the leading terrorists in the world.
We invited the public to consider if they feel more threatened by terrorism in the US or by the risk of being caught up in a mass shooting.
I actually feel threatened by the lack of moral outrage against preventing gun violence, against murdering children, against standing up for the rights of all human beings. And I'm morally outraged by some of the political campaigns that talk about individuals. We are a community, we need to be together, but we do indeed need to fight terrorism and people who want to harm other people. That violence is now a global epidemic as well as it is a uniquely individualized American problem.
Mass shooting, there's no question.
Certainly not terrorism. I don't know that I feel more threatened by either than by, I think the vast majority of citizens have more of a threat of, catastrophic illness, losing their job, the whole fear thing comes out of a sense of insecurity.
Definitely the mass shooting one. Definitely. I mean, the terrorism is such a tiny fraction of a percentage, but there are, in my opinion, a lot of people now who have had their fear level whipped up by these irresponsible politicians and who should never have a gun in the first place, who can get them because of our lax gun laws.
I would feel more threatened about being caught up in a mass shooting.
Which is the bigger danger for American citizens? Terrorism or a mass shooting? We gave the last word to our experts.
Definitely a mass shooting. I don't think so-called international terrorism is even. I think you have a greater chance of being sort of hit by a car, hit by lightning, or winning the lottery than being shot by an internationally motivated terrorist. So, yes, a mass shooting would probably be more of concern.
What I can say is, about 2 months ago, I offered my son the opportunity to go to US Satan, to go on a training program, a Pan-Africanist training program that's being offered for young people in US Satan. It was to be part of his rites of passage. My son thought about the offer. He was excited by the idea of going to US Satan. And then he reminded me that the police go around killing African people there. He reminded me that it was hunting season on African boys there. And he reminded me that he didn't feel that it would be safe for him to go to a place where we know in advance that he is, a prime candidate for being hunted. So my son didn't feel safe going there. I suspect the majority of African people in US Satan don't feel safe being there, and they certainly feel less safe when guns are around.
In 2013, intentional gun-related homicides in America exceeded 11,000, and all gun fatalities were 3 times greater. The New York Times editorial noted that guns are weapons of war, barely modified and deliberately marketed as tools of macho vigilantism and even insurrection, that these killing sprees are all in their own ways acts of terrorism. Known globally for its gun violence and mass shootings, only America seems unwilling to accept the greater threat is not international terrorist activity, but a homegrown shooting epidemic, which in terms of outcomes has turned out to be far more lethal.